In the name of God who was and is to come. Amen. From our first lesson today. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them. School started in Ohio this past week. I'm particularly tuned into this because of family connections. My wife welcomed 29 first graders to her virtual classroom on Monday, and then on Tuesday, my grandson started second grade with other members of his learning pod, a pod that had been put together by his parents and other parents who were trying to figure out how to do their jobs and educate their kids in the midst of a pandemic. Schools and colleges are all over the place in terms of what they're doing. Some are starting entirely online, some are entirely in person, and some are using a hybrid model. It's all a big experiment, and I have yet to speak to a single person who's happy with the alternatives. There's a lot of anxiety and confusion about what to do, because this year, everything has changed. One thing that has not changed, however, is how many first day of school pictures that parents have been posting on social media. A friend of mine posted a picture of his 18-year-old daughter on her first day at Ohio University. It was taken in her bedroom at home rather than in her dorm room in Athens, since OU is starting this year online. Our neighbors posted pictures of their kids starting 3rd and 5th grades. They had backpacks on their backs and smiles on their faces. Here at All Saints, we're asking parents to send first day of school pictures to us too, so that we can include them in the 9 o'clock service on September 20th. That's the day when we'll be blessing backpacks and laptops and iPads and teachers and students and parents, just about everything and everyone as a new school year begins. I mean, if ever God's blessing was needed, this is the year. Many of the first day of school pictures that have been posted so far are a kind of, split screen format showing the same kids at earlier and later stages in their lives. I think you know the ones I'm talking about. A first day of kindergarten picture juxtaposed with a first day of high school picture, a toddler picture next to a first day of college picture. We look at those pictures and we ask ourselves, where did the time go? How did they grow up so fast? You may be thinking the same thing when we read about Moses in our first lesson today. Just last week, Moses was a baby in a basket. Just last week, Shiphrah and Puah were disobeying Pharaoh's orders. Just last week, the infant Moses was being rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. But when we meet Moses this morning, he is a grown man living in the wilderness, tending the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro. Clearly, a lot of time has passed and we've got some catching up to do. When we last saw Moses, he had just been delivered to Pharaoh's daughter. He had spent his childhood with his mother as his nursemaid, saved from genocide by the midwives, by his own family's shrewdness, and by the compassion of the princess. He had grown up among his own people who were enslaved by the Egyptians and who had been conscripted into forced labor. When Pharaoh's daughter took Moses as her son, it must have been an enormous change for him to go from living among the oppressed to living in the king's court. It must have been like winning the lottery, both the upside of that and the downside of it. On one hand, Moses had gone from rags to riches, from hand-me-downs to royal robes, from a little tiny house to a great palace. On the other hand, Moses had also gone from the familiar to the foreign, from Hebrew culture to Egyptian culture, from being a slave to having slaves. The Bible doesn't say what went on in Moses' mind, but we can imagine that there was some churning, some sorting out of who he really was, some struggle with his identity. Was he a Hebrew or an Egyptian? Who was his mother? Was it Pharaoh's daughter or the woman who had borne and nursed him? Were his loyalties with Pharaoh, or were his loyalties with the people that Pharaoh was oppressing? These conflicts came into sharp focus one day when, the story tells us, Moses went out to his own people and saw their forced labor. While he was there, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. What should he do? Whose side was he on? He looked this way and that, the story continues, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. At that moment, the die was cast. Even a king's grandson can't get away with murder, and the circumstances of the murder, who committed it, who was murdered, and why, would have left no doubt among the Egyptians about Moses' loyalties. Moses had no choice but to run. There was a price on his head, and he could not stay. So Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the Sinai desert, where he found a new home among the Midianites, nomads who moved with their flocks of sheep and goats from one oasis to another. Before too much time had passed, Moses settled down, married the daughter of the Midianite priest Jethro, and tried to put the past behind him. He took a new identity as a Midianite shepherd with a young wife and a child. God, however, had other plans. And Moses reveals those plans one day when Moses leads his father-in-law's flock out beyond the wilderness to the mountain of God. There, Moses catches a glimpse of a bush that is burning. Blazing is the word the Bible uses, but the bush is not consumed. This strange phenomenon gets Pharaoh's attention, and he has to see why this is happening. So he turns aside in the direction of the bush and the direction of God, and God seizes the chance to engage Moses then and there. God calls Moses by name, and he begins a dialogue that changes his life, and with it, the course of history. God tells Moses that the plan is to free the Hebrew people from bondage, and God tells Moses that he is the one who has been called to do the job. I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt, he says. This story is so incredibly rich that it has inspired literally thousands of sermons about God choosing shepherds as leaders, about burning bushes and what they symbolize, about negotiating with God, and about how the God we worship can't be controlled or manipulated to do our bidding. But what I want to talk about this morning is why God tracked Moses down in the first place. Here's the answer to that question. God said, I have seen the misery of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their sufferings. God was responding to a people crying out because of the brutal and oppressive ways they were being treated. The time has come, God says, for the subjugation of the Hebrew people to come to an end. It was crystal clear what God was up to 33 centuries ago and whose side God was on. God was all about liberation. What about now? I don't think it requires any special gift of discernment to understand what God is up to these days. They didn't use biblical language, but The Milwaukee Bucks understood what God is up to when they decided not to play a playoff game on Wednesday night. The rest of the NBA and the WNBA understood what God is up to. 5 Major League Soccer games and 3 Major League Baseball games were called off because athletes understood. Colin Kaepernick understood when he took a knee. Tommy Smith and John Carlos understood back in 1968 when they raised their fists at the Olympic podium. These athletes knew and know that God has seen the misery, that God has heard the cry of black and brown people because of their oppression, that God knows their sufferings, and that God will deliver them. Bushes have been blazing in cities and communities all over America this summer, most recently in Kenosha this past week, where a police officer shot Jacob Blake, another unarmed black man, 7 times in the back in front of his 3, 5, and 8-year-old sons. Jacob Blake's father said the next day that his son was shot as if he didn't matter. But he went on, "My son matters. He's a human being, and he matters." God knows that Jacob Blake matters. And what God is up to, what God is trying to do, is to stop the pandemic of police violence against black men once and for all. And not just the pandemic of these shootings, but every way our society says that black lives don't matter. God saw the misery of the Israelites, heard their cry, knew their sufferings, and came down to deliver them. But God didn't deliver the Israelites alone. He didn't deliver them unilaterally, and God will not act unilaterally in our own day to eliminate oppressive systems. Back then, God called Moses, a stuttering, reluctant shepherd living a settled, comfortable life, to join the mission of liberation. Now, God calls us. Ending oppression will not be easy. Pharaohs hold on tight to their power. And the sad fact is that too few people see the situation as it really is. I was deeply disturbed this week when I read about the results of a poll conducted by NPR and Ipsos recently. The poll showed that while some people have responded to the calls for action to remedy our country's racist past and present, these people remain a small minority. The survey showed that just 36% of those polled said that they had taken concrete action to better understand racial issues after George Floyd's killing back in May. Sadly, white people were the least likely of any group to have done so, at just 30% of them. To put this another way, less than a third of people like me have done anything to try to understand the issues, even as this nation navigates its most consequential racial justice movement in over half a century. That's stunning to me, and I hope it's stunning to you. What this means is that at the very least, we have 2 immediate tasks ahead of us. First, each one of us has to redouble our own efforts to listen and to learn about the experiences of black and brown people. One way we can do this is when All Saints offers the Speak Up training on how to talk to our children about race. The program starts on September 17th and it goes for 7 weeks. You can contact Liz Futrell or any one of us on the staff for more information about how to sign up for that. Then in December, Courtney Reed will lead a program called Pathways to Reconciliation, It's a diocesan program that's an exploration of our collective paths and their impact on the present. In addition, our parish's anti-racism team has been posting bi-weekly book recommendations on our social media. Second, each of us has to redouble our efforts to encourage our families, friends, and neighbors to learn and grow too, to see bushes blazing all around them, and then to be curious enough to ask, why is it that they're on fire? Even in these polarized times, we can say to those who are closest to us, look over there, that bush just burst into flame. The work of becoming anti-racist and of leading others to become anti-racist is hard and it's costly. It is painful to hear God say, I have seen the misery of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their sufferings. And it's even more painful to know that our ignorance and our inaction have contributed. But as Christians, we believe that penitence always opens the way to new life. I want to close this morning with this prayer from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Here's what his prayer says. O God, whose Son in anger drove the money changers from the temple, let the anger of the families of George, Brianna, Jake, and others, slain or wounded, be to the cleansing of this land. O God, we hold before you the anger, the rage, the frustration, the sorrow of all Black mothers and fathers who demand for their children the same chance to grow up loving and unafraid as any white mother or father wants for their children. In penitence, we offer you our own mixed-up anger, that it with theirs may be taken up into your redemptive will, in which the clash between anger and fear, oppressed and oppressor, can give way to the incomparable action of agape love, bringing about the reconciliation, the embrace of the other, the alien, the enemy, creating the festival of Shalom, in which the wolf shall lie down with the lamb, and the whole of life on earth shall rejoice in the splendor of your glory. Amen.